Right. Okay. And let's welcome the last speaker for today. That's Björn Petersson, docent in practical philosophy, my supervisor, and also a chair of the Philosophical Society between 1987, 1990, and then again 1994 to 1996.
Thanks, Alex. I'm very honored to be invited to talk here. And I'm also very glad to talk in the company of Peter and Lena and Svante, whom I learned things from, all three of them. Svante was my teacher very early on Theaetetos in theoretical philosophy, Plato's Theaetetos. Peter, among very many other things, gave a talk to the Philosophical Society many years ago, where he diagnosed the illusion of free will. And he did that in a way that was relevant to what I was trying to do in my dissertation. And if I remember his explanation correctly, I still think it's correct. Lena was my student in my class on Hume's Treatise of Human Nature once. She made a remark about Hume's views on property, which I still used to bring up when I still teach that class on Hume's Treatise of Human Nature. And I used to bring up the point. And later in her career, she has also said some things that has made me talk about some parts of Hume's works differently. It's especially the slightly embarrassing chapter on the female virtues of chastity and modesty that I used to skip before, but now I really sort of discuss that with the students. Okay, I guess that there are some very natural questions for a philosopher to ask at the Centennial celebration of a philosophical society. So the first question that comes to mind, of course, is what do we mean when we use the phrase philosophical society? Alex said a little about that, or about the first part of it at least. But I approached the question in a different way. I looked it up I looked up the term philosophical in my encyclopedia at home, Norstedts uppslagsbok from 1962. The encyclopedia explains that to be philosophical is to med jämnmod möta livets öden. That is, to be philosophical is to meet the challenges of life with equanimity. And a society, according to the same source, is simply a voluntary alliance of people. So a philosophical society is a voluntary alliance of people who meets the challenges of life, the ups and downs of life with tranquility and calmness. So now we have a definition. There is a second philosophical question that seems very relevant at an occasion like this, and that is a question about the ontology of a philosophical society, its individuation and its persistence over time. Since we are celebrating, since we are at the Centennial celebration, we can conclude that a philosophical society can persist over at least 100 of years. The apparent issue is about how this is possible, given that the members of the society now weren't present when I was the chairman in the 80s and 90s, and none of them were present in 1922. So I thought that I should give an account of how that is possible. But then I realized that Tobias, I don't know where Tobias is now, there. Yeah, Tobias may have answered this question, perhaps in his 2014 paper in Dialectica on institutional objects and persistence. So right after I'm finished, I think you should approach Tobias too, and he will explain how this works to you. I won't make any more attempts to be philosophical, except in the sense defined by my encyclopedia. I will just somewhat randomly bring up a few memories of people and events from my time as a chair. The Department of Philosophy, but not so much the Philosophical Society, I believe, differed from how it is now, apart from being smaller, as Peter said, in terms of the number of employees and students. Another apparent difference that Peter also mentioned is about the level of internationalization. Almost all employees and doctoral students at that time were of Swedish origin, well, except Tony, of course, who is proud of his Danish origin, and he doesn't like to be reminded that he was born in Malmö. But Limhamn, yeah. And actually, we also had a Finnish-Swedish librarian, Stig Nystrand, a Wittgensteinian who had studied with Georg Henrik von Wright. And I shouldn't forget our philosophically oriented cleaner, Fernando Flores, who actually later did a PhD in history of ideas and got a lectureship at Svante's department. But apart from those, it was a very Swedish and even Scanian context. And in that context, I think that the Philosophical Society did a lot to internationalize the environment. So just during my years as a chairperson, we had talks, for instance, with Philip Pettit, who presented his and Michael Smith's paper, Background in Desire, which was very useful to me in my work. Hugh Mellor was there and talked about time. Richard Hare defended his views in an excellent symposium that I will say a little more about later. Roger Crisp gave an ethical defense of meat eating, although he was a vegetarian himself. Ted Honderich gave a critical talk about conservatism that made a lasting impression on me, perhaps not so much for philosophical reasons as for political reasons. We had talks during these few years by Ruth Millikan, Mary Mothersill, Jaakko Hintikka, and Dagfinn Föllesdal. Föllesdal defended a kind of moral realism along with coherentism about moral knowledge, if I remember correctly. Robert Nozick visited us, and so did Janet Radcliffe Richards, Michael Sloat, Jim Griffin, and Risto Hilpinen. He talked about the semantics of norms and directions, and I have my notes from his talk here. Yeah, and on the back side, on the other side of these notes, is a list of people who asked questions in the Q&A. That was first Søren Halldén, then Peter Gärdenfors, and then Lars Lindahl. After that, Stefan Andersson, who is here today. Peter again, and then Stefan Andersson again. And last was Nils-Erik Salin. So one of the Philosophical Society events that I remember most vividly for its philosophical qualities, but maybe even more for the preparations and arrangements around it, was our symposium with Richard Hare in 1989. We had 4 speakers in 2 days, apart from Richard Hare himself. The speakers were, we had rather long talks and long responses from Hare and Q&As. So we filled 2 days with just 4 speakers. One of our speakers was Vlodek, who was still in Uppsala at that time. Another was Ingmar Persson, who is now Professor Emeritus from Gothenburg. Apart from Ingmar's great philosophical work, he's known for his ties to Derek Parfit and his black belt in karate. There is also one other thing that is less well known. He was my supervisor for a while, and he's still a good friend, so I think that I may reveal this. Unless he has sold it recently, he's also the owner of an almost complete collection of Swedish Donald Duck magazines, and they have been published weekly since 1948. Okay, the third speaker at this event was Thomas Wetterström, an interesting docent in philosophy from Gothenburg that who knew a lot about classical phenomenology. And the fourth speaker was Petersson, who took his PhD with her in Oxford and later became a professor at the Danish Royal Institute of Agriculture, and also a well-known expert on animal ethics in Denmark. I chaired that symposium the second day, and I could tell that Herr was rather pressed by the criticisms he got. He also had great respect for Vlodek, because Vlodek had written a quite technical dissertation on the notion of universalizability, which is very central in Herr's moral theory. And Herr seemed a bit embarrassed that he thought that he really ought to have a better grasp of what Vlodek said in that thesis than he managed. That wasn't the topic of your talk at the symposium, though. The symposium resulted in a special issue of Teoria. It's here. It's from 1989. It's well worth reading. It contains one flaw, though. It mentions that the papers come from a symposium that took place in Lund, but it doesn't mention that this symposium was arranged by the Philosophical Society. And given the number of letters that were sent, I mean, as Peter said, these were old-fashioned surface mail letters that were sent before this thing was settled, and the practicalities that needed to be fixed. I think that the society should have been mentioned. I took a look in the archives, the Philosophical Society's archives last week, and I found a bunch of letters between me and Richard Hare. And I then checked a box in my attic back home, and I found some more letters. I will give them to you later, Alex. Most of the letters concern dates and travel and the form for the symposium. But two letters from her were about the hotel bed. Hare was traveling with his wife Catherine, who was a really nice person. In his first letter, Hare instructed me to book a double room, and he clarified further that a double room is a room for two persons with one bed in it. And just a week later, he sent another letter that he stressed that the bed has to be, quote, what we call a matrimonial bed. And Grand Hotel promised me to do their best. Another thing at this symposium concerned transport. Hare wanted us to pick them up at Copenhagen Airport by car, and also to be transported back to Copenhagen by car after the symposium. So we had Petersson meet them at the airport with his car. He drove them to the ferry. This was long before the bridge. He put them on the ferry, and then Tony, I think, met them by the ferry in Limhamn and took them to Lund, or perhaps you took them to dinner or something, I don't remember. And the day after the symposium, Herr was invited to give a talk in Copenhagen before he should go back to Oxford. That talk was on just distribution of healthcare, so it was completely different from the meta-ethical themes at our conference. And it became my task to drive the Hares to Copenhagen, to the philosophy department. So I took my 1970s Volkswagen bus, and I placed the Hare couple on the pillows on the wooden seats that I had built myself for the purpose of easy conversion to camping. And then they were joined by Dick Haglund, professor of philosophy of religion, and Hjalmar Wennerberg, docent in theoretical philosophy, and also, I think, by Stefan Andersson. Yeah. Okay, we took the car on the ferry and it all went well, and we listened to Hare's talk. They were very satisfied with this. They seemed to find the transport okay. We listened to the talk and said goodbye to the Hares, and then I and my girlfriend back then went to Tivoli, along with Hjalmar Wennerberg and Dick Haglund, and also Urban Forell, who was a professor of philosophy of religion in Copenhagen. And we had some ice cream and a shooting contest before we went home. Speaking of Hjalmar Wennerberg, he and another former board member of the society, David Stansvik, started. I talked to David last week, and he really regrets that he cannot be here today. They started a table tennis team, so they were sort of predecessors to some of the doctoral students at the department who started playing table tennis at Lux not so long ago. They started a table tennis team, and they competed in university tournaments against considerably more young and fit students, mostly technology students, who formed the other teams. Each competition consisted of 3 games, 2 singles and 1 double. And Hjalmar used to win his single and David lose his. And then they won the double thanks to Hjalmar. They managed to go rather far in the tournaments that way. Hjalmar had been a table tennis champion back in Uppsala in his youth, and he was very tall and had long arms, and he had a way of killing even. Sorry? Okay, great. Yeah. This was sort of a detour about table tennis. Yeah. So back to letters again. I found another set of letters in my attic, also concerning accommodation, and these were exchanged between me on behalf of the Philosophical Society and Thomas Wetterström. But that was sometime before the Hare Symposium, when Wetterström had been invited to give a talk on his own at the society. Wetterström must have been in his late 40s then, and he lived with his mother and used to travel with her. This may have been well known in philosophy Sweden back then, but it wasn't known by me. So when I realized that he needed 2 hotel rooms and not only 1, it was too late and the hotel was fully booked. And it ended with me quickly tidying up my flat and finding somewhere else to sleep. And Thomas Wetterström and his mother borrowed the flat. And they were really happy with this arrangements. And I have a lovely thank you letter from Thomas Wetterström's mother here. The letter describes in some details their journey home by car from Lund to Gothenburg, how they stopped at one place and watched trains go by, and how they took a pause outside Markaryd with their coffee tray in the car while the rain poured down. And she ends the letter by saying that she hopes that my future career will go well, and she says, I quote this in Swedish first. She ends the letter: Jag säger som Astrid Hedenius en gång för länge sedan sa till Thomas, lycka till. So what she said was, I'll say to you what Astrid Hedenius said to Thomas once a long time ago, good luck. And Astrid Hedenius was the wife of the person who didn't give a talk at the 50-year celebration. I said that the department, no, one more thing, one other letter. And I found another letter in the books in my attic, and that was between me and Mogens Blegbad, who was professor in philosophy in Copenhagen, and he was, at least to me, he was known for his error theory and metaethics, which may have preceded Mackie's, I don't know. And this exchange concerned a planned talk at the Philosophical Society, which was postponed and postponed again and again in the winter of 1988. And the reason that it was postponed was that the sound was completely frozen. So no ferries went between Sweden and Denmark during several months. Okay, I said that the department was different from now in terms of internationalization. It was also different in terms of professionalization. There was room for some characters that weren't really expected to do any research or teaching. They were employed at some kind of special contracts. There was Bengt Sjöman, who has been a member of the board of the Philosophical Society. And he has also given one talk that I have listened to the Philosophical Society. He was a philosopher of language. He knew a lot about that area of research, at least unless it was more recent than the 50s or something like that. When I got my first workplace at the department, I shared a room with some others and with Bengt Sjöman. Bengt Sjöman had his desk just behind my chair, and he used to take a nap every day, lying flat on his back on his desk. I sort of got used to his snoring after a while, and it became comforting. Another person in this category who became a friend of mine and whom I believe I learned a few things from was Lars Fröström, who was also active in the Philosophical Society, at least as an attendant. During the last years of his life, he used to spend at least 1 week each summer with me on Ven, where I live. But the rest of the time he spent at the philosophy department in Kungshuset. When I first met him, he had spent decades writing numerous drafts of his PhD thesis, always smoking, and taking lunch breaks for lunch he had canned nutrition drinks with chocolate taste. Finally, he decided to defend his thesis, and it's actually quite good. I have the thesis here. I still actually look up things in it. The focus of the thesis is on how to analyze the sentence "Lund's cathedral is gray." It was on 352 pages. But yeah, but actually it's a quite good thesis. It says a lot about different theories of what a judgment is, what propositions are, what facts are, and things like that. So one can learn something from reading it. Unfortunately, it's in Swedish. Lars Fröström died predictably from emphysema. Eventually, I inherited his workplace by the east side wall on the 3rd floor of Kungshuset. Behind my chair on the wall, the burn marks from his cigarettes were still there. So he used to lean towards the wall like this, and then it became burn marks. Because of that. He also continued to make himself reminded by the clear and distinct sound of his typewriter. Many years after his death, it could be heard in my office. And I'm very happy that Dan Egonsson is here now, because I think he's the only one who can confirm that that sound was heard in my office long after Lars' death. Dan and I even once took some skeptical guests from a party in Kungshuset to my office to let them listen to Lars Fröström's typewriter, and I think we managed to scare them a little. I said that while the philosophy department has changed, my impression is that the philosophical society has not changed much. I'll modify that claim a little. There are at least 3 things I believe have changed, and the first is clearly for the better. I believe it's highly unlikely that the philosophical society today would arrange an all-male symposium, at least not without making efforts to make completely sure that there are no interesting female philosophers in this specific area of the symposium that we have overlooked. Although we discussed gender balance a lot already then, but I think there is a difference. Such considerations now are much more self-evident and always in the back of our head if we plan a philosophical event. Another more minor change concerns something that I miss from that time, and that is the Philosophical Society's cooperation with our colleagues in Copenhagen. We announced the program of the Copenhagen Society for Philosophy and Psychology at our department, and they did the same with our program so that people could visit each other's activities. And the highlights of this cooperation was our yearly joint event, where we either went to Copenhagen or they came to us. We listened to a talk, and then we went out for dinner and drinks and discussed philosophy. This was philosophically rewarding, but it was also great fun, especially, I must confess, when the meetings took place in Copenhagen. Then the last thing I will say is that there is another difference, and I may, of course, not be aware of everything that happens at the Philosophical Society now, but we had really great big parties in Kungshuset, lasting long into the night with dancing and sometimes even with live music. I think that if the Philosophical Society just makes sure to have more and longer and larger parties, it will be fine for at least 100 years more. Thanks.
That's like, thanks. Okay. Let me write that down. So bigger, bigger parties, longer parties. Yes. Dancing. Right. Okay. Well, we can like start already tonight. So we're ready to host you again in the staff pantry for a dinner where we can, I don't know, reminisce about old times.